Hello and welcome to the second season of Same Old News. Episode 2, the Cape Town Gazette's turbulent first year. Hello everyone and welcome once again to Season 2 of Same Old News, the show which analyses the press of the past to show how not much has really changed. I'm your host Josh, and this season we're looking at individuals and specific papers. Last time out, we looked at John Bell in the last decades of the 18th century in London. This time though, we're going to a different corner of the planet. Cape Town in present-day South Africa, in the dying breaths of the 18th century. Colonial conservative papers have been somewhat of a blind spot for many historians. Most early papers have been labelled as nothing more than censored gazettes. But I beg to differ. Today's episode shall attempt to show otherwise with the first British paper in colonial South Africa, the Cape Town Gazette and African Advertiser. This paper was the sole publication in the colony until the 1820s and had dominance over all information. It had the support of the colonial government, and for most of its early history it could be said to fit that stereotype of censored gazette. But the first year was far from it. Rather, it was its own production, run by two merchants with relatively little experience in newspapers. And it became a conservative mouthpiece, shielded and supported by the then governor of the Cape government. But within a year, that governor and the publishers were gone. The governor faced corruption charges in Britain, and the Cape government removed those two publishers and editors for a more centralised control. So, what happened to the Cape Town Gazette? That is what we hope to answer today. To understand how we get to the Cape Town Gazette's founding and somewhat independence, we need to understand the transfer of governors that led to this. The first Governor-General of the British Cape Colony was Earl George Macartney, most infamous for his leadership of the Macartney Embassy to China in 1793. He was rewarded for that embassy, among other government duties, by being named the first Governor-General of the Cape Government from 1797 to 1798. With this, he brought in all of his patronage network to the important positions in Cape Government, most notably a man named John Barrow, and we'll be hearing a lot more about him another time. But Macartney settled in, set up the government, and established knowledge of the colony and its surrounding territory for the British government in Westminster. Then, in November 1798, he resigned due to ill health. His successor was quickly selected, and it was former Member of Parliament and Pitt government loyalist Sir George Young, Baronet. To give you a good idea of how good Young was at the job as Governor-General, a civil servant from the late 19th century, George McCall Field, did a history of the early Cape government and described Young as, quote, the most incompetent man who has ever been at the head of affairs in the colony, end quote. Historian Frank Welsh added that he was insanely corrupt, even for the standards of the day. Young also did not like the state of the colony, seeing it as filled with Macartney supporters, so he chose to make a mark of his own. It was also an important time in Britain. The Revolutionary Wars were in full swing by 1799, and the fears of Jacobin spies and revolutionaries, Irish rebellion and French invasion were still very much present. There were also frontier wars against the local populations which were being exacerbated by white settlers. Young was aware of both of these things, so he had a double job on his hands. Protect the Cape as a British colonial possession and a stop point to the Indian trade, as well as his own goal of making a name for himself in colonial government. It's at this point that we have entering stage right Alexander Walker and John Robertson. Walker and Robertson were merchants who ran their own small-scale company, rather imaginatively named Walker Robertson & Co. They traded in goods coming from Britain, wood, local produce, but also enslaved people, the latter making up a large proportion of wealth for many British traders in this period. Walker and Robertson at the time were in need of support for their company to stay afloat, and also wanted to establish themselves further in Cape society. Walker and Robertson were also very much of the conservative political slant and being anti-Jacobin, as their limited documents and later newspaper exploits would show. 5th of January 1799. Letter from the undersigned to Lieutenant Governor of Cape Colony, Major General Sir Francis Dundas. Sir, we, the gentlemen in the Civil Department, together with the principal English inhabitants of this place, desirous of emulating the glorious example shown us by our countrymen at home, who have bravely stood forward in the hour of danger against a host of foreign and domestic enemies, beg leave to make you this public offer of our services in assisting to defend this valuable colony against the enemies of our most gracious sovereign, should they dare to attack it. And although few our number, yet we trust that you will find us ready and able, when called upon, to execute any command you may then think proper to honour us. We have, etc., signed John Holland, John Hook Green, John Barrow, Alexander Walker, John Murray, Akeson Maxwell. It's early summer 1800, in the office of Governor-General George Young. He's working away with a mountain of documents to review and letters to respond to. It's a busy job, but he's also expecting a meeting any minute now.
Enter. Ah, Mr. Walker, Mr. Robertson, do come in.
Good morning, Governor. I hope we're not disturbing your business. We can come back later if need be.
Nonsense, John. These McCartney cronies keep hounding me every second. I hardly get any time to think. You two, though, some real talent in front of me. Take a seat. To what do I owe the pleasure?
Well, we shall keep it brief, my lord. We do not wish to waste any of your time. We have noticed that things have been on the mend since you have arrived at the Cape. No doubt from your good governance, of course. Exactly as John said, your good governance.
Well, McCartney ruined certain things around here. Left me a mess to clear up. What did he say it was? Illness. I would be sick if that was how I ran a government.
We would be too, Governor, handing positions out to his friends. You would do no such thing, Governor. However, John and myself have been looking to expand our business somewhat, and we were wondering if you would be able to help facilitate that in your lofty position, as it were.
Well, you two have been excellent servants of the Cape, no doubt, especially with your marvellous trading company. I have been sitting on some contracts for a while now. I have just had the issue of choosing who to give them to. I know you have been eyeing the timber business as well. It just so happens that I have a contract for a monopoly of that industry, if you so desire it.
Oh, why, that would be too kind of you, my lord.
I do have a request for both of you, though. I have heard you both wish to establish a paper in the colony. Did my ears deceive me?
They most certainly did not, my lord. We have thought about it and of course would not commit to such an act without your approval.
Well, I think the people here are unaware of the good work my government has been doing since I arrived. Also, it would be good to have an outlet for announcements, proclamations, and the like. I've been looking for a good set of editors to establish a newspaper, and, well, I think I see two very sublime editors in front of me here. What do you say to that?
I am sure we can manage the business of a newspaper on top of our other interests. I say it's a deal. What about you, John? An excellent opportunity for us, Alexander, but also for the government, I would say.
Well, a deal is a deal. I shall set up the proclamation as soon as I get through this other pile of documents, as you can see. Mr. Walker, Mr. Robertson, my pleasure doing business with you.
Proclamation by Sir George Young, Baronet, etc. Notice is hereby given that Messrs. Walker and Robertson have my permission to set up a printing press and to publish a newspaper weekly, and the aforesaid persons are to be considered as the sole printers of government and the only licensed printers in this colony. Nor shall any public order, vendue, or mercantile notices, bills of sale, or advertisements be published but by the said printers, either in their newspaper or handbills printed by them. And all matters so printed by them shall be deemed sufficient notices of such matters. Castle of Good Hope, 21st day of July, 1800. Signed, George Young. So, Walker and Robertson had control of the paper, with a monopoly on printing, and little to no oversight by the government, outside of ensuring that government notices were printed. They both took this and ran with it. Most of the paper was, indeed, dry news about ships coming and going, news from newspapers delivered by ships, and some notices. But there was also a tinge of political discussion. Walker and Robertson made it clear that the paper was pro-British government, not only in the maintenance of the Cape Colony. It made sure that it presented the Cape as an extension of British anti-Jacobinism and pro-monarchy sentiment. Reports extensively went over how the French Revolution began in 1789, with a sentimental angle on the French monarchy. This report went on for months in multiple parts. But there were also reports of letters from Europe decrying a French reign of terror in invaded territories. One letter, supposedly from Amsterdam, was printed which stated, quote, "Since the arrival of the French in our country, liberty has taken flight into another, and taken confidence, commerce, for which our country was so noted, and morality along with it, for which we have received in return 40 millions of assignments, which are not become waste paper, and with which our French brethren paid us for everything which they purchased and carried out of the country, Jacobin clubs, plunderers, and military commissaries, who have already evinced to us their dispositions by ordering Dutch women to be shot, constantly quartering troops upon the inhabitants at their own expense, an inconceivable propagation of the scurvy and other diseases." End quote. There were also reports of an attempt on King George III's life, which showed great relief at the failure of the assassination attempt. The king, meanwhile, they described as society's, quote, "brightest ornament and a loyal people of the best of kings," end quote. They extensively covered the trial and the defence by the would-be assassin, and praised the outrage of the public towards the man. Quote, "Never was loyalty more affectionately displayed than on that evening. On the villain being apprehended, the whole house cordially joined in the chorus of God Save the King, and ladies huzzahing and waving their handkerchiefs." End quote. There's a clear loyalist and pro-government tone. But, meanwhile, Walker and Robertson were busy in more business-related matters. The Cape Town Gazette was littered with advertisements for their sales and business dealings, prioritising their sales over other trading companies in the colony. This could also be due to Young's favour towards them. He provided them with a monopoly for the timber trade in Cape Town, all this done through Young's secretary Richard Blake. But Young didn't only favour Walker and Robertson. More corrupt actions were being conducted on his watch, and pressure was building. It would only be a matter of time before his work would be known to officials in London. It's the 2nd of May, 1801, in the office of Lord Hobart. Hobart is the Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, so he has a lot on his plate managing communications across the Empire with a threadbare staff, let alone a war as well. Enter Lord Hobart. May I present you with some papers we have received from the Cape? Yes. Place it with the other documents I need to read. Just on the desk in the corner. Thank you. Well, place it over there, young man. I have much business to do and no time to do it. With respect, Lord Hobart, I really think you should prioritise these papers here. What for, young man? What could the Cape possibly be doing that demands my undivided attention over the other colonies? Well, out with it. My lord, there are further reports that the Governor-General, Sir George Young, is engaging in corruption. Well, that is a strong accusation, young man. Hand me the papers. What has the Governor-General done now? Certainly, my lord. The list is rather extensive, but he gave monopolies to two gentlemen by the names Walker and Robertson without authority, also potentially through his secretary. They have used that government monopoly for their own private trade, and the governor may have profited from it as well. He also attempted to hand over government land to a Mr. Duckett. There may have been an offer of gifts in exchange for the land to Governor Young. Also, there was a recent case of a private individual under Walker and Robertson's company who allegedly used that company's ship to correspond with our enemies. The Governor-General reportedly met with Walker and Robertson and managed to get the man bailed, though he was charged with offences amounting to high treason. This is among other charges made by lords. They're all in that document there. Oh, well, yes, this cannot be avoided, especially with the other reports we've received of late from the Cape. We must deal with this at once. I shall write to Major General Dundas at the Cape at once. You're dismissed. What was Mr. Pitt thinking when he appointed George Young as the Governor-General? Damn fool! Sir, accounts have reached me of a variety of abuses having taken place under the government of Sir George Young, tending to the injury and vexation of the inhabitants of the colony, the prejudice of the interests of this country, and greatly affecting the honour and character of the British government. I am induced to direct your attention to the first instance to remedy the evils and correct the abuses therein stated, and for the purpose, in the next place, of enabling me to judge, if such an inquiry shall not previously have been instituted, how far it may be advisable to recommend to His Majesty to institute an inquiry of a very serious nature into the conduct of Sir George Young and the persons supposed to be connected with him in the transactions referred to. Soon after this, Young was removed as governor in order to face these accusations of corruption, and Major General Francis Dundas was made, for the second time in his career, acting Governor-General. One of his first orders of business was to establish an internal investigation of the Young administration, and he hired government officials for this task, notably the aforementioned John Barrow, a veteran of the Macartney governorship and a close confidant of Dundas. Dundas also made haste to quickly remove Walker and Robertson from their positions with the Gazette. He had mentioned to Lord Hobart his position on the paper itself at the time. He saw a newspaper, quote, under proper restrictions, useful in the administration of public affairs. The establishment of a printing press, nevertheless, during the administration of Sir George Young, I conceive to be premature and more likely to produce evil than good effects, end quote. Dundas felt that the private printing, while not illegal or wrong, was not best for the colony at the present time, but suppression of the press was not an option either. He felt that the best middle road would be a paper under much more direct control, especially without Young's favoured pair, Walker and Robertson. Quote, I have thought it advisable, until honoured with your lordship's instructions on this subject, the purchasing from the proprietors on colonial account the whole printing apparatus, placing it under the immediate inspection of government, in the office of the Secretary of Colony in the Castle, under the superintendency of Mr. Barrow, Auditor of Accounts. End quote. Barrow took the Cape Town Gazette in October 1801 and immediately showed it was different from the previous iteration. It was to be a more neutral, heavy quotations, paper in Barrow's image, with a discussion of geography and an attempt to grow imperial knowledge. To quote from their prospectus, it being our principal aim to render this paper as much as possible a register of facts which, when given in their original and simple dress, are less liable to mislead or bias than if attended by speculations, however plausible or well-grounded they might appear. Were it even advisable to enter into the wide field of politics, the narrow limits of our paper would not allow it. Whenever, therefore, a suspension of news from Europe, India, or elsewhere allows us a little spare room in this paper, it appears to us that the same cannot be more agreeably, and at the same time more advantageously employed, than by disseminating in the first place among the inhabitants a more general and accurate knowledge of the southern angle of Africa than they have hitherto had an opportunity of obtaining, as, for example, sketches of the geography and extent of the colony, and remarks on a variety of other subjects, equally interesting to the British settlers and the native inhabitants." End quote. There is a lot to take away from this first year. The first thing to take away is the closeness of many colonial papers to the government, but also the distance they had. In the case of the Cape Town Gazette, there was obvious support through the provision of notices and announcements which acted as a formal legitimizer of the paper for government sponsor. But there was also a distance in the paper being run by private individuals. This distance allowed for discussion of political content. There was, in the Cape Town Gazette's case, a pro-government, anti-Jacobin, loyalist tone in the paper, coming from the publishers, which this element of distance enabled. It is with the financial takeover that the distance is closed and it becomes a dry government mouthpiece of announcements and information. The other thing to note from this story is patronage. Government patronage was starting to reduce as you get deeper into the 19th century, but in the British colonies it was still alive and well in 1800. The publishers of the Cape Town Gazette were chosen due to who they knew and the relationships they had. Walker and Robertson were sponsored by their patron, the Governor-General Sir George Young. Barrow, meanwhile, was in the right place and time to take over the Cape Town Gazette from his patronage through previous Governor-General Macartney, and in his selection as the new editor was due to his favourable opinion with his new patron, Sir Francis Dundas. Barrow would make use of his patronage to further advance his career in government, but also in the press. But that's a topic for another episode later on this season. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Same Old News. Next episode, we shall be travelling once more. Specifically to Kolkata, present-day India, in the early 1780s, where a rivalry was brewing through the newspapers being published there. If you enjoyed, please leave a like or a rating depending on where it is that you're listening. Also follow our social media on Twitter and Instagram to get updates on new episodes. Links are in the description of this episode. All that's left to say is thank you once again, and I shall see you soon for the Same Old News. Thank you for listening.
Isaiah.